I'll start by telling you very briefly a little bit about the project and what we did, and then I'm going to dive in mostly to talking about the kinds of trends that we saw and what the media and information landscape, particularly in terms of extremism and violent extremism, looked like. So to start with, this research was the second component of a two-part project funded by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It began with a capacity building component that brought together participants from 4 countries across Southeast Asia, providing training on actually some of the things we've talked about today already, around content moderation, strategic communication frameworks, and building resilience through media and information literacy. This included government and civil society organisations. Importantly, this included 2 parallel studies that followed on from this, one in Indonesia and one in Malaysia, both of which sought to assess in each country the existing media and information landscape and to identify existing relevant good practices and, importantly, challenges to responding to those online extremism challenges. So this presentation today is going to talk about some findings from both of those contexts. But I have to say, before I go any further, a big thank you to all of the other experts who worked with me on this, because I am one co-author among many. My HEDAYAH colleague Farangiz Atamuradova, our colleagues from CIRCIT, the Southeast Asia Regional Centre for Counterterrorism, who are joining us today and who you'll hear from later. Galen Lamprier-Engeland, who worked with us as an expert on the study on the online extremism components, and Indonesia, the support that we received from their BMPT has been incredibly valuable to the study. So I am one among many voices who have looked at this context to bring these findings to you. So the goal of all of this was to support online counter-extremism activities in Malaysia and Indonesia. And to do that, we sought to identify existing good practice as well as present and emerging trends and challenges. The overarching objective of these reports was to produce evidence-based research on exactly this context, but more specifically on how extremist groups are acting within those landscapes, on what the needs identified were to respond to this, particularly hearing from frontline practitioners of counter-extremism, as we called them, which included civil society organisations working with youth to try and combat online extremism. It also included government practitioners who were dealing with content moderation challenges. So we heard from a range of people who are dealing with the front line of countering extremism online. You can see here the main research questions that we had for the project, which were essentially as follows. What lessons, challenges, responses and needs could we find from those people who were working at the very front line of counter-extremism in these contexts? What does the existing media and information landscape look like based on not just what we heard from practitioners, but also looking at the literature and hearing from experts about the context, And what emerging trends were we concerned about in the online ecosystem that people thought that we needed to be thinking about? In terms of our methodology, I'll keep it very brief, but it was primary qualitative research with key stakeholders, including academics, civil society, the frontline practitioners we talked about, and across both of the countries that we worked in, as well as a secondary review of all of the existing literature we could find in those contexts about the online media and information landscape and violent extremist and terrorist trends. I'm going to talk, because I think it's really important in this context for us to talk about both of these countries separately. While there's a lot of parallels and we're talking about one region and we see some of the same trends that we've seen everywhere, they're very meaningfully different. So I'm always going to try to talk about what we found in both of the countries that we looked at here. The first question that we sought to address, as I mentioned, was around the existing media and information landscape and how it was contributing to the dissemination of dangerous content on online platforms. So in Malaysia, we have a highly connected digital environment. It's characterized by widespread internet access and social media use, which makes everyone extremely well connected, but unfortunately, as we know, can provide fertile ground for extremist exploitation. We know that nearly as much as 96% of Malaysian youth will have connections to the internet, which is a pretty high number. The country's digital spaces have become increasingly saturated with a range of content, including religious, political, and identity-based narratives. And importantly, online presence spans all age groups, from more and more of all the different demographics, present on the internet, indicating a broadening digital landscape. Extremist actors have seized this opportunity, adapting their recruitment and their propaganda strategies to fit popular platform dynamics in the most effective ways possible. The experts that we talked to highlighted that the sort of rural-urban dynamics that once were really, really critical in terms of radicalization dynamics in this context have become less important with the rise of online connectivity, and with those who are more rural or more urban facing some of the same challenges with that new kind of access. Online spaces are seen to be growing in popularity for extremists to disseminate information and to recruit individuals, although it's really important to note that in this context, like some others, a lot of local groups still prefer to apply more traditional and offline methods of recruitment, but have found good ways to leverage a mixed approach where they can draw people in through online spaces, but still heavily rely on offline recruitment. We've also, which I'll talk a little bit later about some of the financing components here, which I think are very interesting, but as they do in many contexts, tactics involve strategically amplifying existing local grievances like economic inequalities, socio-political marginalization, seeking to create or exacerbate social divides through disinformation campaigns, targeted trolling, and a number of other strategies. Some experts have indeed suggested that the media outlets involved in this context are contributing to the problem. We see a lot of clickbait headlines, divisive imagery, and a lack of diverse perspectives, although, as we've noted, this is not necessarily unique, but an important factor in this particular landscape. In Indonesia, meanwhile, we see that while new platforms and applications have increased connectedness, they've also similarly been tools for malicious actors to reach 212 million internet users in Indonesia. If you're ever thinking about why it's useful and interesting to talk about this context in a room in Europe, it is because there is a huge amount of internet users who are facing some of the same challenges that we are talking about here today, but with additional nuance in a lot of ways. In practice, extremists in Indonesia, I think perhaps even more so than in the Malaysian context we talked about, really still have strong offline radicalization processes, but the use of online or digital radicalization to spread propaganda and to direct individuals to closed online and offline groups is very strong and growing. We've seen international terrorist groups such as Daesh increasingly adapting their tactics to target individuals by translating material into local languages. We're also actually seeing some new complexities in these contexts, in Indonesia in particular, where we've seen recent reporting by UNICRI finding instances of Indonesian-speaking discussions from Telegram users expressing neo-Nazi views, including things like discussing Mein Kampf or talking about the Christchurch attacks. So while there's more limited evidence of far-right or radical right activity in offline spaces, it's really important to take into consideration and closely monitor this trend of seeing extreme right-wing terrorist or radical right or far right, as you prefer to call it, imagery, propaganda, and content and views being expressed in these spaces that are traditionally have seen other ideologies be more prominent. The interviewed experts that we talked to in Indonesia particularly underlined the concerns around recruitment and radicalization in prison contexts, where perhaps not surprisingly, depending on your knowledge of the context, online ecosystems are seen as one of the main sources of radicalization in prison contexts, which is an incredibly important factor to consider. In fact, some of the latest terrorism-related arrests in Indonesia are people who were radicalized online. That included the arrest of a 19-year-old male in East Java last year, who was reportedly radicalized through social media and planned to bomb 2 churches in his region, which I think really further highlights the online-offline intersection that is taking place in this region, just like many others. While there's a lot of visible progress on how online platforms are improving their regulations on content moderation and other relevant approaches to tackle this, our Indonesian colleagues flagged that the situation is still one that requires a lot of attention because, much like many other contexts, extremist and terrorist groups have been great at identifying loopholes in the approaches to content moderation. And as we've already heard a little bit about, content moderation is much better at working in English. Sometimes it's very good at working in Bahasa Indonesian, but in both Indonesia and Malaysia, when we start to deal with the linguistic complexities, we see increasing challenges with content moderation. And we also hear a lot of challenges about how far away from these centralized hubs the content moderation powers might rest. While each country has their own mechanisms for working on content moderation, the platforms and where they're based might be increasingly far away and might make it harder for them to do the kind of coordination needed to address this challenge. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the narratives that we saw coming out in both of these contexts, and then I realize I'll have to wrap it up there. In the Malaysian context, we saw that extremist narratives and propaganda remain a persistent challenge, just as they do globally, and they play a critical role as a tactic used by actors to spread their messages online and incite violence. Leveraging digital platforms, extremists develop and amplify their messages to provide alternatives to their followers on existing grievances. So, in Malaysia, what we saw most was local narratives around identity, religion, and emerging nationalism continuing to be the most prominent themes used by extremists. We particularly saw and have observed, both from experts but also from literature, an increase in ethno-nationalism tied with religious supremacy. Sometimes this is called the far right, although there are some distinctions that are really important here. What I think is important to take away is a lot of cross-pollination of both messaging and tactics. This is something we see in European contexts, but it looks a little bit different when we think about the different kinds of ideologies that might be intersecting, of course. In the Indonesian content, we saw a lot of concern around increases in regional specific extremist narratives, often focused on local and identity issues. Particularly, for example, local extremist organizations leveraging, reframing and translating Daesh propaganda, for example, into local languages and using that to disrupt national and local events like elections. So we really do see that global-local intersection in both contexts and in terms of the narratives that are being whether exploited or hijacked or created in both of these contexts.